The lame horse was doomed. Until the young woman approached and whispered something in its ear. When it took the first step, the millionaire was frozen in shock. The first streak of dawn painted the Kentucky sky in hues of pale gold and pink as Guadalupe Martinez opened her eyes. For a moment, she lingered in the hazy space between dreams and waking, her fingers instinctively tracing the familiar ridge of tissue that ran from her left eye to her chin. The scar, a memento from a childhood accident with barbed wire, had been with her for nearly 2 decades now, long enough that she sometimes forgot it was there until she caught a stranger's startled glance or heard a whispered comment. The aluminum walls of her trailer creaked as she rose from bed, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. The small space was neat but worn, every surface telling the story of previous owners and years of make-do repairs. On her nightstand, illuminated by the strengthening light, stood a framed photograph. Her parents, young and smiling, standing before rows of tobacco plants, their hands stained from the harvest that would eventually claim their lives. "Buenos dias, mamá y papá," she whispered, a ritual as consistent as her heartbeat. At 28, Lupe lived a life defined by routines and hard work. She showered quickly, the lukewarm water sputtering from pipes that protested with each use. Her wardrobe offered little variety. For the Dixie Diner, a faded blue uniform with a name tag. For the houses she cleaned, simple t-shirts and jeans. For the Westbrook Estate stables, clothes that could withstand dirt, hay, and the occasional kick. Today would be like most days. 3 jobs, minimal rest, and the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that invisibility was often safer than being seen. The Dixie Diner buzzed with the morning crowd when Lupe arrived. Farmers in dusty caps, office workers grabbing coffee before commuting to Louisville, and the regulars who claimed the same booths every day, discussing weather and local politics as if both were personal affronts. "Order up for table 7, called Marge, the cook who had worked at the diner since before Lupe was born. Lupe balanced the plates along her arm with practiced ease. Table 7 held the Henderson brothers, cattle farmers with land bordering the Westbrook estate. "Here you go, gentlemen. 2 specials with extra bacon," she said, setting down the plates. The younger Henderson nodded thanks, but the older one barely acknowledged her presence. As she turned to leave, she caught the tail end of his comment to his brother. "Still don't know why Joe keeps her on. Bad enough we got the Mexicans in the fields, now they're serving our food too." Lupe's steps didn't falter. She'd long ago learned that responding only made things worse. Instead, she refilled coffee cups, wiped down counters, and tucked away tips that were invariably less than what her white co-workers received. By noon, she had traded her diner uniform for cleaning clothes and was dusting crystal figurines in the Wilson mansion. Mrs. Wilson, a society woman with more money than kindness, followed her from room to room, watching for mistakes. "Be careful with those," she cautioned, as Lupe cleaned a collection of porcelain birds. "They're worth more than you make in a year." Lupe nodded, not mentioning that she had been cleaning these same figurines every Tuesday for 3 years without incident. In the Wilson household, as in many she cleaned, her skill was expected but never remarked upon. Her presence tolerated but never welcomed. It was only when she arrived at the Westbrook estate for her evening shift that Lupe felt something like peace. The stables, with their smell of hay and leather and horse, reminded her of childhood visits to her grandmother Esperanza's small house on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez. The old woman had been known in the community as a curandera, a healer with an uncanny ability to calm injured animals. "They recognize pain in others, mijita," her grandmother had told her once, while tending to a wounded desert hare. "They don't need words." The Westbrook estate sprawled across 500 acres of Kentucky's finest bluegrass country. The main house stood like a white Greek temple on a distant hill, but Lupe's domain was the state-of-the-art equestrian complex closer to the service entrance. Richard Westbrook, a 62-year-old oil magnate from Texas, had established himself as a force in the racing world, his distinctive emerald and gold silks appearing regularly in winners' circles across the country. Lupe had just begun her evening routine, sweeping walkways, refreshing water buckets, checking feed bins, when the unusual procession appeared. A specialized horse trailer, flanked by luxury vehicles, rolled slowly up the private drive. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension in the air. Billy Thompson, the middle-aged stable manager, emerged from the office, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Stay out of the way," he warned Lupe. "Mr. Westbrook's new investment is arriving." She nodded and retreated to the feed room, but curiosity drew her to the small window that overlooked the main yard. The trailer door opened, and 4 men in veterinary scrubs approached cautiously, speaking in low, urgent tones. Then he appeared. Thunderstorm. Even in his diminished state, the thoroughbred was magnificent. Coal black with a single white sock on his right foreleg, he stood over 16 hands high, his breeding evident in every line of his powerful body. But something was terribly wrong. The horse moved with painful reluctance, his back legs dragging slightly. Worse than the physical damage was the look in his eyes, wild with fear, rolling white at the edges, the gaze of an animal that expected pain from every human touch. Lupe recognized that look. She had seen it in stray dogs that frequented the trailer park, in the eyes of migrant children new to the county, sometimes in her own reflection. Richard Westbrook himself supervised the arrival, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the stable yard setting. His silver hair caught the late afternoon light as he conferred with a man holding a clipboard full of documents. "He's worth more alive as a stud than dead," Westbrook was saying, his Texas drawl more pronounced when he was tense. "I don't care what it costs. Fix this machine." In the following weeks, Lupe observed a parade of specialists attempting to rehabilitate Thunderstorm. Each arrived with confidence and departed looking defeated. The horse's injuries from his catastrophic fall at the Kentucky Derby had healed imperfectly, leaving him with chronic pain and a pronounced fear response that made treatment nearly impossible. She learned the details in fragments from overheard conversations and the gossip of other stable hands. Thunderstorm had been leading the Derby when something, perhaps a reflection, a sudden movement in the crowd, spooked him. The footage, which had played on sports channels nationwide, showed the magnificent animal stumbling, then cartwheeling in slow motion through the mud while thousands watched in horror. His jockey had been thrown clear, but Thunderstorm had risen from the mud trembling, his back legs damaged, his trust in humans seemingly shattered forever. The specialists grew increasingly desperate. First came gentle approaches, hand-feeding, soft voices, patient attempts at grooming. When these failed, more aggressive methods followed. One trainer tried to establish dominance through prolonged restraint sessions. Another advocated a regimen of tranquilizers to reset the horse's nervous system. 3 stable hands had already been injured attempting to manage the traumatized animal. Thunderstorm was kept isolated in a separate stall, away from the other valuable horses. At night, Lupe could sometimes hear him pacing, his hooves striking an irregular rhythm on the concrete floor, occasionally punctuated by desperate whinnies that sounded almost human in their distress. On a Friday evening, as Lupe was finishing her tasks, a summer storm rolled in from the west. The sky darkened prematurely, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley. She was sweeping the main corridor when a different sound caught her attention, a high panicked whinny from Thunderstorm's isolated stall. The other stable hands had already left for the day. Billy Thompson had departed early for his granddaughter's birthday dinner. Lupe hesitated, knowing she should leave as well, but something in that sound pulled at her. Not the usual anger or aggression, but naked fear. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the stable through the high windows, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Thunderstorm's response was immediate, a sound Lupe had never heard from a horse before, something between a scream and a sob. Driven by instinct more than reason, she made her way to the isolated wing where Thunderstorm was kept. A sign on the door read, "Danger, authorized personnel only." But the horse's distress calls continued, growing more frantic with each thunderclap. Lupe approached the stall cautiously. Through the bars, she could see Thunderstorm pressed against the far wall, his magnificent body trembling violently. His eyes, usually fierce and challenging, now showed only terror. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder, and the horse tried to back further into the wall, as if hoping to disappear through it. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, their eyes met. Thunderstorm's wild with fear, Lupe's soft with recognition. Two wounded creatures carrying different scars but knowing the same language of pain. También tengo miedo de las tormentas, she whispered. I'm afraid of storms too. She didn't attempt to enter the stall or even approach the bars too closely. Instead, she simply sat down on a bale of hay several feet away, visible to the horse but maintaining a safe distance. When another thunderclap shook the building, she began to hum softly, an old Mexican lullaby her grandmother had sung during desert thunderstorms. Al arroyo niño, al arroyo ya. Her voice was quiet but steady, offering not control but companionship in fear. For over an hour, as the storm raged outside, Lupe simply sat and sang, occasionally speaking gentle words in a mixture of Spanish and English. She didn't try to make Thunderstorm respond or even look at her. She simply offered presence. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the horse's trembling subsided. Though he remained alert, his breathing slowed. Once, when thunder rattled the windows with particular violence, his eyes sought hers, as if checking that she was still there, still unafraid. The storm always passes, she told him softly. Siempre pasa. As the storm moved eastward and the spaces between thunder grew longer, Lupe continued her quiet vigil. The physical and emotional exhaustion of her long day began to catch up with her. Her voice grew softer, her eyelids heavier. The last thing she remembered was Thunderstorm's gaze, still fixed on her, but somehow different. Assessing, rather than panicking. She awoke to morning light and the rough voice of Billy Thompson. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he demanded, his weathered face a mask of concern and anger. Lupe scrambled to her feet, disoriented. She had never meant to fall asleep. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. There was a storm, and he was scared, and I just—" She stopped mid-sentence, noticing what Billy had already seen. Thunderstorm stood calmly at his feeding trough, methodically consuming the morning hay, the first time he had eaten normally since his arrival weeks before. "What did you do to him, girl?" asked Billy incredulously, while Thunderstorm maintained his eyes fixed on Lupe, as if fearing she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. "What did you do to him, girl?" asked Billy incredulously, while Thunderstorm maintained his eyes fixed on Lupe, as if fearing she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. Lupe stood awkwardly, brushing hay from her clothes. "Nothing, Mr. Thompson. I just sat with him during the storm." She gestured vaguely toward the stall. He was scared of the thunder. Billy's weathered face creased with skepticism. "You think a Mexican cleaning girl understands million-dollar thoroughbreds better than professional trainers?" His words were harsh, but his eyes kept darting to Thunderstorm, who continued eating calmly, a stark contrast to the aggressive, unpredictable animal of the past weeks. "My grandmother taught me about frightened animals," Lupe said quietly. "Sometimes they don't need training. They need someone to just be there." Billy snorted. "Well, don't go getting ideas, and don't come in here unauthorized again. This animal is dangerous. He's already put 3 handlers in the hospital." He checked his watch. "Your shift ended hours ago. Go home and get some real sleep." As Lupe gathered her belongings, she glanced back at Thunderstorm. For a brief moment, the horse raised his head, nostrils flaring slightly as if catching her scent. Something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the barrier of species. Then Billy's voice broke the spell. "Today, Martinez, I've got work to do." Over the next few days, Lupe found herself rearranging her life around Thunderstorm. She negotiated with Marge at the Dixie Diner to start her shift 30 minutes earlier. She explained to Mrs. Wilson that she needed to compress her cleaning schedule. Each adjustment created small pockets of time, 15 minutes here, half an hour there, that she could spend at the Westbrook stables before and after her official shift. During these stolen moments, Lupe established a careful routine with Thunderstorm. She never entered his stall, never pushed for contact. Instead, she simply sat on the same hay bale at the same distance, and read aloud. Her first selection had been impulsive, a dog-eared paperback of The Old Man and the Sea, borrowed from the Wayland County Library. The book's worn spine and faded cover bore testimony to countless readers before her. The old man was thin and gaunt with deep wrinkles in the back of his neck, she read softly, her accent caressing Hemingway's sparse prose. Thunderstorm's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, gradually swiveling forward, the first sign of relaxation in a horse. On the third morning, Dorothy Abernathy, the silver-haired librarian who had checked out the book, appeared at the counter when Lupe returned it. "Did you enjoy Hemingway?" she asked, her kind eyes crinkling behind cat-eye spectacles. "It wasn't for me," Lupe admitted. "It was for a friend who's having a hard time." Dorothy nodded as if reading aloud to troubled souls was the most natural thing in the world. "Perhaps your friend might enjoy poetry. Sometimes the rhythm soothes when prose cannot." She disappeared into the stacks and returned with a slim volume of Pablo Neruda's work. "Bilingual edition," she explained with a conspirator's smile, "in case your friend understands Spanish better than English." That afternoon, Richard Westbrook arrived at the stables with a new specialist, a compact, efficient Swiss man with cutting-edge equipment and an air of absolute certainty. Lupe, sweeping the corridor, kept her head down as Westbrook led the man to Thunderstorm's stall. $2 million, Westbrook was saying, his Texas drawl elongating the word million. "That's what I paid for him before the accident. His bloodline alone is worth that to the right breeding program." The Swiss specialist nodded. "With my method, we recondition the neural pathways. The animal must learn that humans equal safety, not danger." Lupe continued sweeping, inching closer to overhear. "The insurance company is breathing down my neck," Westbrook continued. "They won't pay out the policy while he's still alive, but I'll be damned if I'll put down an animal with his reproductive potential." The next hour unfolded like a grim theater piece Lupe had witnessed too many times before. The specialist entered the stall with a complex harness system, speaking firmly and moving with confident precision. Thunderstorm's response was immediate and violent, rearing, kicking, eyes rolling with the same terror she'd seen during the thunderstorm. The specialist retreated hastily, narrowly avoiding injury. "He's more traumatized than I anticipated," he admitted, smoothing his rumpled shirt. "We'll need to sedate him before attempting the reconditioning protocol." As they walked away, Lupe heard Westbrook's frustrated response. "That's what the last 3 experts said. I'm not paying you for excuses." In the quiet of early evening, when the specialists and grooms had departed, Lupe returned to her hay bale with Neruda's poetry. Thunderstorm stood at the back of his stall, still agitated from the earlier session. "Tengo hambre de tu boca, de tu voz, de tu pelo," she read softly. "I hunger for your mouth, your voice, your hair." The melodic Spanish flowed into gentler English. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Thunderstorm's rigid posture softened. By the third poem, he had moved slightly closer to the front of the stall. That night, for the first time, Lupe brought a small offering, a crisp apple cut into thin slices. She placed the pieces on her open palm and set her hand on the ground, making no attempt to extend it through the bars. "My grandmother said food is a bridge between souls," she told Thunderstorm conversationally, "but only if offered without expectation." The horse watched her with wary intelligence. He made no move toward the apple, but his nostrils flared, taking in the sweet scent. Days stretched into weeks. Lupe's unauthorized routine became a secret backbone to her existence. Dawn found her reading poetry to Thunderstorm before her diner shift. Dusk saw her returning with small offerings, apple slices, a carrot, a handful of fresh mint. She never pushed, never reached, never tried to hurry the glacial pace of trust being rebuilt. One morning, Billy Thompson caught her red-handed, sitting on her hay bale reading The Old Man and the Sea aloud. He had approached silently, intending to reprimand her for unauthorized access. Instead, he stood frozen, watching Thunderstorm lying peacefully in his stall, head turned toward Lupe, utterly absorbed in her voice. "What exactly are you doing with that horse?" Billy demanded, causing Thunderstorm to startle and Lupe to nearly drop her book. "I'm not doing anything," she explained, closing the book carefully. "I'm just being consistent. He needs to know there are predictable things in the world." Billy's weather-beaten face registered conflicting emotions. "Mr. Westbrook has spent thousands on specialists who can't get near that animal, and you're just reading to him?" "He was hurt in front of thousands of people," Lupe said simply. "Maybe he needs one person to start with, not a crowd." Billy studied her for a long moment, then checked his watch. "You're supposed to be at the diner now, aren't you?" Lupe nodded, gathering her things quickly. "Tomorrow," Billy said gruffly, "you come find me before you start your shift. We're going to do this properly, with authorization. I don't need you getting kicked by a traumatized horse on my watch." The next afternoon, Dorothy Abernathy welcomed Lupe into the library's reading room after regular hours. The elderly librarian prepared tea in delicate cups that seemed too fragile for practical use. "So, you're the girl who's working miracles with Richard Westbrook's terrible horse," Dorothy said, offering a plate of cookies. Lupe blushed. "No miracles, Mrs. Abernathy. Just patience. Call me Dorothy, dear. And patience is a miracle in this impatient world." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "My late husband trained horses for 40 years. He always said they don't trust words, but the breath of the one who speaks them." Lupe smiled, remembering her grandmother's similar wisdom. "My abuela said something like that. She could calm any animal, even the wild ones people thought were dangerous." "Tell me about your method," Dorothy encouraged, settling back in her chair. "There's no method," Lupe admitted. I recognize something in him. The way he looks when he's scared. It's how I felt when I first came to Wayland County. Everyone staring at my scar, making judgments, keeping their distance." She touched her face unconsciously. Sometimes all you need is someone who lets you be afraid without making it worse. Meanwhile, Richard Westbrook paced his office overlooking the training grounds, phone pressed to his ear. "I understand the policy terms," he snapped, "but this is ridiculous. The horse survived. That should be celebrated, not penalized." The insurance representative's voice remained implacably professional. "Mr. Westbrook, the $5 million mortality policy only pays out if the animal dies from covered causes. As long as Thunderstorm remains alive, there's no claim to process." "He's essentially useless as a racehorse," Westbrook argued. "That's the same as dead in this business." "Perhaps, but our veterinary consultants believe rehabilitation is possible. Until all medical options are exhausted or humane euthanasia is performed, the policy remains in force but inactive." After hanging up, Westbrook stared out at the rolling Kentucky landscape that had cost him a fortune to acquire. The Westbrook estate was meant to establish his legacy in the racing world, to prove that a self-made Texas oil man could stand alongside the old blue blood families of the sport. Thunderstorm had been the cornerstone of that dream, until the accident. The next morning, Billy Thompson met Lupe at the service entrance. "Ground rules," he said brusquely. "You get 30 minutes before your shift and 30 after. You stay outside the stall at all times. Any sign of aggression from the horse, you leave immediately." He handed her a small two-way radio. "And you keep this with you. Any trouble, you call me." As the days progressed, Lupe gradually introduced new elements to her routine with Thunderstorm. She brought a small portable radio, playing it at barely audible volume, slowly increasing it to acclimate him to mechanical sounds. She carried a soft brush that she left by the stall door, letting him become familiar with its appearance before ever attempting to use it. Word about the Hispanic cleaning girl who talks to horses began circulating through Wayland County. At first, it manifested as cruel jokes at the Dixie Diner. "Heard Westbrook's got himself a Mexican horse whisperer," one regular smirked as Lupe refilled his coffee. "Probably some voodoo witchcraft." But the narrative began shifting when Dorothy Abernathy spoke up at her Bible study group. After a discussion about unlikely vessels for God's work, Dorothy cleared her throat. "Speaking of which, there's a young woman in our community with an extraordinary gift for healing. Perhaps we should be supporting her rather than gossiping." Pastor Mike, a middle-aged man with a runner's build and a thoughtful demeanor, looked interested. "Who might that be, Dorothy?" "Guadalupe Martinez. She's doing remarkable work with that injured racehorse everyone's been talking about. The one they said couldn't be saved." A significant shift occurred during a severe electrical storm that swept through the county. Tornado sirens wailed and the stable hands rushed to secure the valuable horses. Thunderstorm, hearing the sirens and thunderclaps, fell into complete panic, rearing, striking the walls, making sounds that seemed torn from his very soul. Lupe, drenched from running through the downpour, arrived to find 3 grooms and Billy attempting to manage the situation. "He's going to hurt himself," one groom shouted over the storm. "We need to tranquilize him." "The vet can't get here in this weather," Billy responded, his face grim. When Lupe approached, Billy spotted her immediately. "Stay back, girl. He's out of control. You'll get yourself killed." But Lupe, driven by instinct and the memory of her grandmother's teachings, moved forward with quiet determination. "Let me try, Mr. Thompson, please." Against his better judgment, Billy nodded and motioned for the others to move away from the stall. With heart pounding, Lupe unlatched the door and slipped inside. Instead of approaching Thunderstorm directly, she simply sat in the corner farthest from the panicking animal. And there, amidst the chaos of the storm, she began to sing the same Mexican lullaby she'd offered during their first encounter. "A la roro niño, a la roro ya." Her voice, barely audible above the thunder and the horse's distress, carried a thread of calm certainty. She didn't move toward Thunderstorm, didn't try to touch or restrain him. She simply existed in the same space, offering the gift of steady presence amidst chaos. Gradually, miraculously, Thunderstorm's frantic movements slowed. His breathing, which had been coming in explosive bursts, began to regulate. And then, in a moment that none of the watching grooms would ever forget, the massive thoroughbred lowered himself to the straw beside Lupe, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his trembling body. The next morning, Richard Westbrook sat in his office, staring at the security footage on his computer screen. The night vision camera had captured everything: Lupe entering the stall, sitting quietly, and the gradual calming of the horse that 3 professional trainers had failed to approach. His face hardened as he reached for the phone. "Thompson," he barked when Billy answered. "Who the hell authorized a cleaning woman to interfere with my $2 million investment?" "Thompson," Richard Westbrook barked into the phone. "Who the hell authorized a cleaning woman to interfere with my $2 million investment?" Billy Thompson stood in the stable corridor, phone pressed to his ear, watching Lupe move quietly through her morning tasks, as if the previous night's miracle had never happened. He cleared his throat. "Sir, I can explain. The situation last night was extraordinary. The storm—" "I don't want explanations," Westbrook cut in. "I want to know why untrained staff are making decisions about an animal worth more than they'll earn in a lifetime." Billy's weathered face tightened. 23 years he'd worked for the Westbrook operation, first in Texas and then here in Kentucky. Never once had he challenged the boss directly. But the image of Thunderstorm lying peacefully beside the cleaning woman during the height of the storm remained vivid in his mind. "Sir," he said carefully, "perhaps you should come see for yourself. The horse is different this morning." 30 minutes later, Richard Westbrook's black Cadillac rolled up the gravel drive. He emerged in tailored slacks and a crisp button-down, looking more like a CEO heading to a board meeting than a man visiting stables. Lupe was sweeping the corridor when Westbrook strode in, flanked by Billy. She kept her head down, focusing intently on her task, but her shoulders tensed visibly. "This is her?" Westbrook asked, as if Lupe weren't standing right there. "The cleaning girl who's suddenly a horse expert?" Billy nodded. "Guadalupe Martinez. She's been with us for about 2 years. Does good work." Westbrook's steel-gray eyes assessed Lupe with the same calculating gaze he used for evaluating potential investments. "Ms. Martinez," he said finally, acknowledging her directly. "I understand you took it upon yourself to enter a dangerous animal's stall during an emergency situation." Lupe finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. The scar that ran from her left eye to her chin caught the morning light, a pale ridge against her brown skin. "Yes, sir." He was afraid of the storm. "I thought I could help." "Based on what qualifications, exactly?" Lupe hesitated. How could she explain her grandmother's teachings without sounding foolish to this man who measured value in dollars and breeding lines? "I don't have qualifications, Mr. Westbrook, just experience with frightened animals." "Cleaning girl with a savior complex," Westbrook muttered, then turned to Billy. "Show me this miraculous transformation I'm supposed to be impressed by." They moved toward Thunderstorm's stall. Westbrook stood back at a cautious distance, having witnessed the horse's violent reactions to previous handlers. What he saw made him frown in confusion. Thunderstorm stood calmly at his feed trough, methodically consuming his morning hay. When the horse sensed their presence, his head lifted sharply. His ears flattened seeing Westbrook and Billy, but when his gaze found Lupe, they swiveled forward in recognition. "This is the same horse that tried to kick Dr. Herzog through a wall yesterday?" Westbrook asked incredulously. "Same horse," Billy confirmed. "Different attitude." Westbrook's face hardened. "Who permitted you to interfere with my investment, Ms. Martinez? A cleaning woman with some trick from the circus doesn't determine how I manage my business." Billy stepped forward. "Sir, she's achieved more progress in weeks than your specialists managed in months." "One calm morning doesn't equal recovery," Westbrook snapped. Then his pragmatic business sense asserted itself. "Fine. You have 1 week. Show me concrete results, or you're fired. And you'll join her, Thompson, if this experiment fails." After Westbrook departed, Lupe leaned against her broom, exhaling slowly. "I'm sorry to cause trouble, Mr. Thompson." Billy shook his head. "Don't apologize for success, girl." He checked his watch. "Aren't you late for your diner shift?" That evening, Dorothy Abernathy closed the library early. At 73, with 47 years as Wayland County's head librarian, she had earned certain privileges. She placed a discreet sign on the door, "Closed for inventory," and welcomed 6 carefully selected guests into the reading room. "Thank you all for coming," she said, pouring tea. "I've asked you here because a member of our community needs support." Sarah Jenkins, a 5th-grade teacher whose autistic son had found breakthrough connections through equine therapy, leaned forward. "This is about Guadalupe Martinez and that racehorse, isn't it?" Dorothy nodded. "Richard Westbrook has given her 1 week to prove herself. The girl has a remarkable gift, but she's being treated unfairly." Pastor Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dorothy, while I appreciate your concern, the church can't involve itself in business disputes." "This isn't about business," Dorothy countered. "It's about recognizing a gift and supporting the person who carries it. Isn't that what community means?" Later that night, Lupe returned to her trailer exhausted from her triple shift. On her doorstep sat a canvas tote bag. Inside, she found 3 books on equine communication, a container of homemade soup, and a note in Sarah Jenkins' handwriting. "My son didn't speak until he met our old horse. Animals see what we often miss." The following morning, Billy met Lupe at the service entrance before dawn. "Ground rules," he said gruffly. "You get 30 minutes before your shift and 30 after. Stay outside the stall unless I'm present. Any sign of aggression, you leave immediately." He handed her a small 2-way radio. "Keep this with you. Any trouble, call me." Over the next few days, Lupe established a careful ritual. She arrived before sunrise, bringing small offerings, a ripe apple cut into precise sections, a handful of fresh mint, a soft brush that she left by the stall door without attempting to use it. "Trust isn't built through force," she explained to Billy, who watched with growing fascination. "My grandmother said horses don't trust words, but the breath of the one who speaks them." On the 3rd day, she brought a small portable radio, playing classical music at barely audible volume. Thunderstorm's ears twitched at the unfamiliar sounds, but he remained calm, watching Lupe from his position near the back of the stall. "I'm gradually increasing the volume," she told Billy. He needs to rebuild his relationship with sound. The accident, all those screaming people, the chaos, it's still fresh for him. Billy nodded thoughtfully. That's actually not far off from what some of the professional trainers recommend for desensitization. Lupe smiled. My grandmother had no formal training, but she understood frightened souls. By the fourth day, word about the Hispanic girl who talks to horses had spread through Wayland County. At the Dixie Diner, Lupe overheard snippets of conversation as she served breakfast. Heard she's some kind of witch, muttered George Baker, a feed supplier who did business with several local farms. Probably using Mexican voodoo or something. His companion, Tom Willis, laughed. Long as it works. Westbrook spent a fortune on that horse. Bet he doesn't care if she's dancing naked under the full moon if it saves his investment. The men fell silent when they noticed Lupe standing beside their table, coffee pot in hand. She refilled their cups with steady hands, her face revealing nothing of the hurt their words caused. That evening, at Dorothy's Bible study group, the conversation turned to unlikely vessels for God's work. Speaking of which, Dorothy said deliberately, there's a young woman in our community with an extraordinary gift for healing. Perhaps we should be supporting her rather than gossiping. Eleanor Peterson, whose husband owned the local hardware store, frowned. You mean the Mexican girl with the scarred face? The one working with Westbrook's crazy horse? I mean Guadalupe Martinez, Dorothy corrected firmly. A skilled young woman using patience and kindness where force has failed. Pastor Mike, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. The scripture tells us that man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Perhaps we should consider doing the same. On Sunday morning, Lupe slipped into the back row of Wayland County Methodist Church just as the service began. She rarely attended, feeling self-conscious about her scar and her accent, but something in Dorothy's invitation had been impossible to refuse. Pastor Mike's sermon focused on the unlikely heroes of the Bible, the stuttering Moses, the shepherd David, the doubting Thomas. God frequently chooses the most improbable vessels for his work, he said, his gaze finding Lupe in the back row. He sees beyond appearance to the heart beneath. After the service, several congregants approached Lupe. Mrs. Peterson from the hardware store pressed a small jar into her hands. Horse liniment, she explained. Special recipe. Might help with those injured tendons. Dr. Morrison's wife, a petite woman with kind eyes, squeezed Lupe's arm. If you need any advice about treating those leg injuries, come by the clinic. We've worked with recovery cases before. On the 5th day of her trial period, Lupe arrived at the stables to find Richard Westbrook waiting, checking his watch impatiently. 4 days and nothing substantial to show, he remarked coldly. Perhaps I was right about circus tricks. Lupe didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, she moved to her usual position near Thunderstorm's stall and began her morning routine. She played the classical music slightly louder than the previous day. She arranged apple slices on her palm and, for the first time, extended her hand slightly into the stall space. Thunderstorm regarded her offering warily. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent of apple and the familiar smell of Lupe herself. For long minutes, nothing happened. Westbrook shifted impatiently. Is this what my money is paying for? Fruit offerings like some primitive... He fell silent as Thunderstorm took a tentative step forward. Then another. With delicate precision, the horse extended his neck and lifted an apple slice from Lupe's palm with velvety lips. Dios mío, Lupe whispered, tears springing to her eyes at this first voluntary contact. Westbrook watched, his expression unreadable. Without comment, he turned and walked away, leaving Lupe to the small miracle unfolding in the morning light. On the final day of her trial week, Lupe arrived with a light rope halter decorated with small, colorful beads made by the children from Pastor Mike's Sunday school. Billy watched nervously as she placed it near the stall entrance, allowing Thunderstorm to inspect it from a safe distance. You sure about this? Billy asked. He hasn't let anyone put a halter on him since the accident. He's ready, Lupe said with quiet confidence. We've been building to this moment. With slow, deliberate movements, she opened the stall door and stepped inside for only the second time. Thunderstorm tensed but didn't retreat. Lupe stood quietly, halter hanging loosely in her hand, making no move toward the horse. "The choice is yours," she told him softly in Spanish. "I will not force you." Minutes stretched into a quarter hour. Billy shifted nervously outside the stall. Finally, Thunderstorm lowered his head slightly and took a step toward Lupe. With infinite gentleness, she raised the halter. The horse flinched but didn't pull away. Gradually, with movements that seemed almost choreographed, she slipped it over his head. "Vamos," she whispered. "Let's take a small walk." Leading Thunderstorm from his stall for the first time in months, Lupe felt the enormity of the trust he'd placed in her. The horse moved with obvious discomfort, his damaged back legs causing a pronounced limp, but he followed willingly through the corridor toward the small outdoor paddock. Billy rushed ahead to open gates. Through the stable windows, Lupe could see other workers stopping to stare at the sight of the notoriously dangerous Thunderstorm, following docilely behind the small figure of the cleaning woman. In the paddock, sunlight fell across Thunderstorm's black coat, highlighting muscles atrophied from confinement. He raised his head, nostrils flaring as he took in fresh air and open space. One of the junior grooms, excited by the breakthrough, rushed forward to take the lead rope from Lupe. Instantly, Thunderstorm reared, eyes wild with sudden panic. The groom stumbled back as Billy shouted a warning. But Lupe remained calm, speaking softly in Spanish until the horse settled again. "He trusts only her," admitted Dr. Morrison to Westbrook, who had appeared at the paddock fence to witness the breakthrough. The veterinarian shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years of equine medicine, I've never seen anything like it. But trust isn't the same as recovery, sir. That animal will never race or carry a professional jockey again." "He trusts only her," admitted Dr. Morrison to Westbrook, who had appeared at the paddock fence to witness the breakthrough. The veterinarian shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years of equine medicine, I've never seen anything like it. But trust isn't the same as recovery, sir. That animal will never race or carry a professional jockey again." Richard Westbrook's face remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the veterinarian's assessment. He watched Lupe lead Thunderstorm in a slow circle around the paddock, the horse's movements stiff but deliberate, his attention fixed entirely on the small woman holding the colorful lead rope. "We'll see about that," Westbrook said finally, checking his platinum watch. "A week has turned into a month. I expect measurable progress, not just parlor tricks." As he strode away toward his waiting Cadillac, Dr. Morrison exchanged glances with Billy Thompson. Both men had worked with enough thoroughbreds to recognize the extraordinary nature of what they were witnessing. A horse deemed beyond rehabilitation now willingly following the most unlikely of healers. The provisional week granted to Lupe stretched into a second, then a third. Each morning she arrived before dawn, her ancient Toyota pickup rattling up the service road, and each evening she was the last to leave. Between her shifts at the diner and cleaning houses, she devoted every spare moment to Thunderstorm's rehabilitation. Her methods confounded the conventional wisdom of equine recovery. Where traditional trainers would have imposed strict regimens and mechanical therapies, Lupe created space for Thunderstorm to heal at his own pace. She spent hours simply sitting in his stall, reading aloud from Dorothy's books or humming Mexican folk songs. On days when Thunderstorm seemed particularly anxious, she would simply exist in his presence, matching her breathing to his until his trembling subsided. "What exactly are you doing?" Billy asked one afternoon, watching her gently massage a homemade poultice into Thunderstorm's damaged hindquarters, the first time anyone had been able to touch his injured legs without sedation. "Building connection," Lupe replied, her hands moving in slow, practiced circles. "His body remembers the fall, the pain, the chaos. Every touch from a human makes him relive that trauma." She paused, looking up at Billy with unexpected directness. "Trauma lives in the body, Mr. Thompson. My grandmother understood this about animals and people both." As the days passed, Thunderstorm's physical condition gradually improved. His coat regained some of its former luster, and the prominent ribs that had spoken of stress-induced weight loss began to disappear under healthier muscle. The most significant change, however, was in his eyes. The wild, rolling terror had been replaced by a watchful intelligence that focused primarily on Lupe. On a crisp September morning, 3 months after Thunderstorm's arrival at Westbrook Estate, Dr. Morrison conducted another evaluation. Lupe stood nearby, keeping the horse calm while the veterinarian carefully examined the damaged hindquarters. "The physical recovery exceeds all medical expectations," Dr. Morrison admitted, straightening up from his examination. "The muscle tone is returning and there's less inflammation around the tendon injuries. But," he added, glancing toward Billy, "he still won't tolerate anyone but her. That severely limits his future utility." Lupe stroked Thunderstorm's neck gently. "He associates humans with pain," she explained. "He needs time to expand his trust beyond me." When Billy reported the veterinarian's findings to Westbrook, the businessman responded with typical pragmatism. "Progress is undeniable, but we need him to accept other handlers. Keep the girl on, but start integrating professional trainers." This proved more challenging than anticipated. Each attempt to introduce another person into Thunderstorm's routine resulted in immediate regression, flattened ears, nervous pacing, and in one case a powerful kick that splintered a stall door. It was as if the horse had constructed a universe that contained only himself and Lupe, with all other humans representing potential threats. Word of the extraordinary connection between the scarred cleaning woman and the traumatized racehorse spread beyond the confines of Westbrook Estate. The first curious onlooker appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, a middle-aged woman in a flowered dress who parked her car along the county road to watch Lupe working with Thunderstorm in the outdoor paddock. By Friday, a small cluster of vehicles regularly lined the roadside during Thunderstorm's exercise periods. People brought lawn chairs and binoculars, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly fascinated by the rehabilitation taking place. Sheriff Johnson, a barrel-chested man with 23 years in law enforcement and a deep suspicion of anything that disrupted county routines, arrived to investigate the disturbance. He parked his cruiser with lights flashing and approached the small gathering with one hand resting on his belt near his sidearm. "What's going on here?" he demanded of a young mother with 2 small children. "Just watching the miracle horse," the woman replied, pointing toward the paddock where Lupe was guiding Thunderstorm through gentle stretching exercises. The one they said couldn't be saved. Sheriff Johnson remained to observe, intending to disperse the gathering if it interfered with traffic. Instead, he found himself transfixed by the scene unfolding in the paddock. The powerful thoroughbred, whose catastrophic fall had been replayed on sports channels nationwide, moved with cautious dignity beside the slight figure of Guadalupe Martinez. There was something in their synchronized movements that spoke of a communication beyond words, a shared language of mutual respect. When Sheriff Johnson returned to his cruiser 30 minutes later, his demeanor had subtly shifted. The next morning, when he encountered Lupe at the gas station, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that startled her more than any hostile glare could have. As October painted the Kentucky landscape in rich autumnal hues, a reporter from the Wayland County Chronicle approached Lupe as she left the Dixie Diner after her morning shift. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Jim Coulter from the Chronicle. People are calling what you're doing with Thunderstorm a miracle. Could I get a few quotes for a feature story?" Lupe's hands instinctively rose to touch her scar, a gesture of self-protection developed over years of unwanted attention. "I'm sorry, but I'm not special. Anyone with patience could do the same." "Not according to Dr. Morrison," the reporter persisted. "He says he's never seen anything like it in 30 years of practice." Despite her reluctance, the story appeared in the next Sunday edition, "The Woman Who Whispers to Broken Horses." The article was respectful, focusing on the methodical rehabilitation techniques rather than sensationalizing Lupe's background or appearance. Nevertheless, it brought a new wave of attention that made her profoundly uncomfortable. Richard Westbrook, ever attuned to opportunity, arrived at the stables the following Tuesday with a proposal. "We should organize a benefit event," he announced to Billy and Lupe. "Show Thunderstorm's progress. Attract investors. Perhaps even donors for a new equine rehabilitation center on the property." Lupe, who had been adjusting Thunderstorm's halter, froze. "A crowd with cameras and noise would destroy everything we've built," she said quietly but firmly. He's not ready. Westbrook's expression hardened. I pay your salary, Miss Martinez. I'm not asking for your opinion. The moment stretched taut between them, charged with unspoken power dynamics. Lupe, the cleaning woman who existed at the margins of Wayland County's social hierarchy, faced Westbrook, whose name adorned buildings and whose wealth influenced county commissioners. You can fire me, Lupe responded with unexpected dignity, but I cannot participate in something that would harm Thunderstorm. Westbrook's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. In his world of oil deals and racing syndicates, direct challenge was rare. You think you know more than I do about my own horse? The silence that followed was profound. Billy Thompson, Dorothy Abernathy, who had come to deliver more books, and several stable hands who had gathered to witness the confrontation remained utterly still, their collective silence a clear statement of support for Lupe. Westbrook, astute in reading rooms where millions were at stake, recognized the shift in allegiance. His face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. We'll revisit this discussion when the horse shows more concrete improvement, he said finally. A tactical retreat rather than surrender. As he strode toward his car, he pulled out his cell phone. Billy, helping Dorothy with her book bag, caught fragments of the conversation that drifted back on the autumn breeze. Sheikh Abdullah still interested in breeding rights? Excellent. We might solve two problems at once. An international buyer won't care about some cleaning woman's sentimental attachment to the animal. The next morning, Lupe arrived to find Thunderstorm unusually agitated. He paced his stall, ears flicking nervously at every sound. When she approached, he pressed his muzzle against the bars, nickering softly as if trying to communicate something urgent. What's wrong, Corazon? She asked, stroking his forehead gently. Billy appeared at her shoulder, his weathered face set in grim lines. Westbrook called this morning. Sheikh Abdullah is coming in 2 weeks to inspect Thunderstorm. He's interested in purchasing exclusive breeding rights. Sheikh Abdullah? Lupe repeated, the unfamiliar name sitting awkwardly in her mouth. Oil money from Dubai. Collects champion bloodlines like some people collect art. Billy hesitated. The deal would include transferring Thunderstorm to his facilities in the Middle East. Lupe felt as if the stable floor had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. Transfer him? He's not ready for that kind of change. The journey alone could destroy all our progress. It's a done deal, from what Westbrook said, papers being drawn up now. That evening, as Lupe drove her rattling pickup toward the trailer park, her mind raced with increasingly desperate scenarios. Thunderstorm, just beginning to trust again, shipped across the world to strange handlers who would value his genetic material, but not his damaged spirit. A light was on in her trailer, unusual, since she lived alone and was fastidious about utilities. Approaching cautiously, she found Dorothy Abernathy sitting on her small porch, a thermos of tea and a folder of papers beside her. I heard about Sheikh Abdullah, Dorothy said without preamble. We need to talk about options. Inside the cramped but immaculate trailer, Dorothy laid out a possible strategy. Jessica Harmon handled that case against Westbrook's company for the creek contamination last year. She knows his legal vulnerabilities. Legal? Lupe shook her head. I can't afford a lawyer. You'd be surprised how many people in this town would contribute, Dorothy replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Especially after Sunday's sermon. Pastor Mike had indeed delivered a pointed message about the Good Samaritan, making not-so-subtle references to those who valued profit over compassion and healing. Several prominent church members had approached Lupe afterward, offering encouragement and practical support. The next afternoon, Jessica Harmon, a formidable woman in her 50s with a reputation for environmental cases against corporate interests, met Lupe and Dorothy at the church office. Legally, animals are property, Jessica explained, studying the notes Dorothy had compiled. Westbrook has every right to sell Thunderstorm to whomever he pleases. Even if it would harm the animal? Pastor Mike asked, having joined the conversation out of growing concern. There's some emerging jurisprudence around animal welfare, Jessica admitted. We might be able to request an independent evaluation, arguing that transfer would constitute a risk to the animal's health. As their discussion continued, Billy Thompson called Lupe's cell phone with troubling news. Thunderstorm's refusing food again, keeps looking at the door like he's waiting for someone. That night, risking his decades-long employment, Billy met Lupe at the service entrance at 2 a.m. "You've got until dawn," he whispered. "No one checks the cameras for this sector until morning shift." In the darkened stable, Thunderstorm's immediate nickering of recognition brought tears to Lupe's eyes. She slipped into his stall, and the powerful animal pressed his head against her chest, as if begging not to be abandoned. "I won't let them take you," she promised, though she had no idea how to keep such a vow. The following morning, Jessica arrived at their meeting with unexpected news. "There is legal precedent for intervention on welfare grounds," she announced. "But we need someone with standing to challenge Westbrook's decision. Ideally, someone from within his family willing to testify that the transfer would endanger the animal." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Jackson," she said suddenly. "Richard's son. He was asking questions at the church fundraiser last month about the miracle horse everyone was talking about." "Jackson Westbrook hasn't spoken to his father in years," Pastor Mike objected. "Not since his sister's accident." "He might for this," Dorothy insisted, "if he knew the whole story." "We only have one legal option," Jessica concluded, addressing the small group gathered in the church's back room. "We need to secure a temporary injunction claiming the transfer would place the animal at risk. But for that, we'll need someone within the Westbrook family willing to testify against Richard." All eyes turned to Pastor Mike, who had mentioned his recent contact with Jackson Westbrook. "We only have one legal option," Jessica concluded, addressing the small group gathered in the church's back room. "We need to secure a temporary injunction claiming the transfer would place the animal at risk. But for that, we'll need someone within the Westbrook family willing to testify against Richard." All eyes turned to Pastor Mike, who had mentioned his recent contact with Jackson Westbrook. The pastor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Jackson was here for the church fundraiser last month. He seemed troubled. Asked about the miracle horse everyone was talking about." He hesitated. "But approaching him means asking a son to publicly stand against his father. Sometimes standing against someone is the truest form of love," Dorothy said quietly, "when what they're doing harms themselves and others." Outside the church windows, autumn leaves spiraled down in the afternoon light. Lupe remained silent, her fingers absently tracing the scar along her cheek. Her thoughts were with Thunderstorm, alone in his stall, unaware that decisions about his future were being made in boardrooms and church offices. "I'll try to reach him," Pastor Mike finally agreed. "But I can't promise anything." In the weeks that followed, Lupe's temporary week of access stretched into a full month, then 2, then 3. Richard Westbrook, though still skeptical of her methods, couldn't argue with results. Thunderstorm had gained weight, his coat regained its glossy sheen, and he could now be led around the small paddock without signs of extreme distress. But the horse's improvements came with a caveat that frustrated Westbrook immensely. Thunderstorm trusted only Lupe. "He needs consistency," Lupe explained one crisp October morning as Westbrook observed her work. In the derby, the world became chaos in seconds. Every unexpected sound, every unfamiliar person brings that moment back for him. Westbrook frowned, watching as Thunderstorm followed Lupe through a series of gentle turns, his damaged hindquarters moving stiffly, but with gradually improving coordination. "Consistency doesn't create market value," he replied coldly. "A horse that only responds to one handler is worthless for breeding programs or competition training." "He'll expand his circle of trust gradually," Lupe insisted. "But forcing the process would undo months of progress." The impasse between them grew as Sheikh Abdullah's visit approached. For Westbrook, the thoroughbred represented millions in potential breeding fees and a business relationship with one of the wealthiest equestrian investors in the world. For Lupe, Thunderstorm was a wounded soul gradually finding his way back to trust. The news about the woman with the scar who talks to horses continued to spread beyond Wayland County. On a bright Wednesday morning, Lupe arrived to find a television van from the Louisville station parked near the paddock where she typically exercised Thunderstorm. "Ms. Martinez," called a polished reporter in an impeccable blazer. "Could we get a few minutes on camera with you and the Miracle Horse?" Lupe froze, instinctively touching her scar. "Please, no cameras," she said quietly. "Thunderstorm is sensitive to new elements in his environment." "Just a quick segment," the reporter persisted. "Human interest story. Viewers love this kind of thing." Billy Thompson appeared from the stables, placing himself between Lupe and the reporter. "This is private property. You need permission from Mr. Westbrook's office for any filming." As the news crew reluctantly departed, Lupe gave Billy a grateful look. "Thank you. Cameras, strangers, noise. It would set him back weeks." "I'm not doing it for you," Billy said gruffly, though his eyes betrayed a growing respect. "That horse is finally making progress. Last thing we need is some TV circus." That afternoon, Richard Westbrook arrived with his proposal. "A benefit event," he announced, his tone making it clear this was a decision, not a suggestion. "We'll invite select guests, showcase Thunderstorm's recovery, perhaps raise funds for an equine rehabilitation center on the property." Lupe felt her stomach tighten. Mr. Westbrook. A crowd would overwhelm him. He's not ready for that kind of exposure. "I'm not asking for your opinion, Miss Martinez," Westbrook replied coolly. "I pay your salary. The event will happen 2 days before Sheikh Abdullah's visit, perfect timing to generate interest and demonstrate value." For the first time since coming to work at the Westbrook estate, Lupe found herself directly challenging authority. "You can fire me," she said, her voice soft but firm, "but I cannot participate in something that would harm Thunderstorm." The stable fell silent. Billy Thompson, Dorothy Abernathy, who had arrived with fresh books, and several grooms all watched the confrontation with held breath. Westbrook's face registered genuine surprise at being contradicted by someone he considered little more than hired help. "You think you know more than I do about my own horse?" he asked, voice dangerously quiet. The collective silence that followed spoke volumes. Even Billy, who had served the Westbrook family for decades, made no move to support his employer. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on Lupe's shoulder in silent solidarity. Westbrook, a businessman attuned to shifting power dynamics, recognized the changing tide. "We'll revisit this discussion when the horse shows more concrete improvement," he said, a tactical retreat disguised as postponement. As he strode away toward his waiting car, he pulled out his cell phone. The fragments of conversation that drifted back told Lupe everything she needed to know. Sheikh Abdullah, still interested. 2 weeks. Breeding rights. Solve 2 problems at once. That evening, as sunset painted the Kentucky hills in amber and gold, Lupe sat cross-legged outside Thunderstorm's stall, reading aloud from The Black Stallion. The thoroughbred stood near the stall door, his intelligent eyes fixed on her face, ears forward in that expression of equine attention that had become increasingly common in their sessions. "He recognizes himself in the story," Dorothy observed, bringing Lupe a thermos of hot tea. A powerful animal, misunderstood, finding connection with one special person. Lupe smiled, accepting the tea gratefully. "My grandmother would say he's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him." "What would she say about Richard Westbrook?" Dorothy asked shrewdly. Lupe's smile faded. "She would say some men mistake ownership for understanding." She stroked Thunderstorm's velvet muzzle as he extended his head over the stall door. "How can we own what we don't understand?" The following Sunday, the small Methodist church was unusually full. Word had spread about Pastor Mike's sermon topic, the Good Samaritan in Modern Times. Without mentioning names, the pastor spoke eloquently about seeing beyond appearances, about valuing compassion over profit, and about recognizing divine work in unexpected vessels. Lupe sat in her customary back row seat, uncomfortable with the occasional glances sent her way. After the service, Mrs. Peterson from the hardware store pressed a small envelope into her hands. "For Thunderstorm's special feed," she whispered. "The store's contribution." Throughout the week, similar gestures accumulated. Dr. Morrison's wife dropped off specialized liniment for equine muscle recovery. Sarah Jenkins brought a recording of gentle nature sounds that had helped her autistic son during anxiety episodes. Even Sheriff Johnson, spotting Lupe at the gas station, mentioned casually that his deputies wouldn't be bothering any roadside observers as long as they didn't block traffic. A tentative support network was forming around Lupe and Thunderstorm, yet Richard Westbrook's plans proceeded unaltered. Equipment for the demonstration event arrived: portable bleachers, a sound system, decorative fencing for a special exhibition area. "He's not listening," Lupe told Billy in frustration. "Thunderstorm isn't some show pony. He's still healing." Billy shook his head grimly. "Westbrook sees dollar signs, not healing, always has." On a particularly beautiful autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the remaining leaves, Lupe was leading Thunderstorm through his daily exercises when an unfamiliar figure appeared at the paddock fence. Tall and lean, with Richard Westbrook's aquiline features softened by a more thoughtful expression, the man watched silently as Lupe guided the horse through gentle stretches designed to build strength in his damaged hindquarters. Thunderstorm noticed the stranger first, his ears flicking forward then back in uncertainty. Lupe followed his gaze and froze, recognizing Jackson Westbrook from photographs in Richard's office. "Please don't stop on my account," Jackson said, his voice carrying the same Texas drawl as his father's, but gentler. "I've been hearing about this miracle for weeks, wanted to see for myself." Lupe nodded cautiously, continuing the exercises while keeping herself positioned between Thunderstorm and the potential threat of a stranger. The horse's trust was still fragile, expanding in tiny increments with each successful interaction. "He's beautiful," Jackson commented after several minutes of silent observation. "Even with the injury, you can see his spirit." "He has a strong heart," Lupe agreed. "Most would have given up after what he experienced." Jackson's expression darkened. "My father doesn't understand the difference between strength and stubbornness." He hesitated, then added, "My sister Rebecca loved horses like you do, seeing them as individuals, not investments." The mention of Rebecca caught Lupe by surprise. The Westbrook daughter's death 5 years earlier in a riding accident was rarely discussed in the stables. "She rode a black gelding," Jackson continued, his eyes fixed on Thunderstorm. "Midnight was his name. Looked something like this one, actually. She died when he stumbled on a jump." Understanding bloomed in Lupe's mind. The reason for Richard Westbrook's complicated relationship with Thunderstorm, the mixture of obsession and detachment. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. Jackson nodded, then pushed away from the fence. "Since Rebecca died, my father treats horses as pure investments. I think it's how he manages the guilt." He turned to leave, then paused. "Pastor Mike mentioned you're concerned about Sheikh Abdullah's visit." "Thunderstorm isn't ready for transfer," Lupe explained. "The journey alone could destroy months of progress." "My father rarely changes course once money's involved," Jackson said, "but I'll see what I can do." As October gave way to November, the preparations for both the benefit event and Sheikh Abdullah's visit accelerated. Lupe's concerns were politely acknowledged, but effectively ignored. Westbrook had committed to a course of action, and the opinions of a cleaning woman, miracle worker or not, wouldn't alter his plans. On a particularly cold morning, Lupe arrived to find Richard Westbrook himself standing outside Thunderstorm's stall with a camera crew. "Ah, Miss Martinez," he said with artificial warmth. "These gentlemen are preparing promotional materials for our benefit event. Perhaps you could demonstrate Thunderstorm's progress." Lupe's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of disruption she'd warned against. Strangers, equipment, expectations of performance. But refusing would only antagonize Westbrook further. "He needs his normal routine first," she insisted. "Let me work with him quietly, then perhaps later." "We have a schedule to maintain," Westbrook interrupted. "The photographer has 3 other appointments today." As the camera crew began setting up lights and reflectors, Thunderstorm grew visibly agitated. His ears flattened and he began pacing his stall, the old nervous rhythm returning to his movements. "Please," Lupe urged. "You're frightening him." "Nonsense," Westbrook replied dismissively. "He needs to acclimate to attention. Sheikh Abdullah travels with an entourage." The first camera flash sent Thunderstorm into full panic. He reared suddenly, striking the stall door with his front hooves. The photographer stumbled backward, and Westbrook barely avoided being hit as the door shuddered under the impact. "Get that animal under control," Westbrook demanded. But Lupe was already moving, positioning herself between the frightened horse and the intruders, her voice a steady stream of Spanish comfort words. "You're proving my point," she said over her shoulder. "He's not ready." Westbrook gestured for the camera crew to leave, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Once they departed, he turned to Lupe, his voice cold with fury. "This is my horse, paid for with my money," he stated. "Your sentimental opinion has no place in business decisions. The event proceeds as planned, with or without your cooperation." "An excellent businessman," Dorothy remarked later when Lupe recounted the confrontation, "but a poor student of nature. You cannot schedule healing to match a calendar." "I don't know what to do," Lupe admitted. "Legally, he's right. Thunderstorm belongs to him." Dorothy's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Ownership is such a limited concept when it comes to matters of the heart. "Tell me, who do you think Thunderstorm believes he belongs to?" Westbrook, meanwhile, placed a call to Sheikh Abdullah's representatives, confirming the upcoming visit. "You'll be impressed by the animal's bloodlines," he assured them. His Derby performance before the accident demonstrated his exceptional speed and heart. That evening, as Lupe worked late, her cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Martinez, this is Jackson Westbrook. I think we need to talk about options. My father just ordered specialized transport equipment for Thunderstorm's journey to Dubai." "Ms. Martinez, this is Jackson Westbrook. I think we need to talk about options. My father just ordered specialized transport equipment for Thunderstorm's journey to Dubai." Lupe's hand tightened around her phone, the plastic case warm against her palm. She stood in Thunderstorm's stall, her free hand resting gently on the horse's neck. The evening light filtered through the high windows of the stable, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. "How soon?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks, Jackson replied. "The Sheikh's representatives are handling the paperwork, export licenses, veterinary certificates, quarantine arrangements. It's all being expedited." Thunderstorm shifted beside her, sensing the tension in her body. The horse lowered his head, nudging her shoulder gently with his muzzle. Over the months, he had become attuned to her emotional states, offering comfort in his own way when he sensed her distress. "He's not ready," Lupe said, stroking the velvet softness of Thunderstorm's nose. "The journey alone, a strange trailer, the noise of an aircraft, unfamiliar handlers. It would undo everything we've accomplished." "I know." Jackson's voice carried the weight of resignation. "But my father sees this as the perfect solution. $10 million for the breeding rights, and Thunderstorm becomes someone else's rehabilitation project." After ending the call, Lupe sank down onto a hay bale, her mind racing with possibilities, each seeming more desperate than the last. Thunderstorm watched her intently, then carefully lowered himself to lie on the fresh bedding beside her. This newfound behavior, his willingness to make himself vulnerable by lying down in human presence, had emerged only in the past week, a milestone in his recovery that had brought tears to Lupe's eyes the first time. "What are we going to do, Corazon?" she murmured, gently running her fingers through his mane. Thunderstorm's response was to exhale deeply, his breath warm against her leg, eyes half closed in an expression of hard-won trust. The following morning, Lupe arrived at the Westbrook estate to find unusual activity near the training paddocks. Workers were assembling a portable pen with specialized padded walls and a ramp leading to a reinforced platform. "Training area for the transport process," Billy explained when he found her watching with concern. Westbrook wants Thunderstorm acclimated to loading procedures before the Sheikh arrives. Has anyone told these people that Thunderstorm still barely tolerates being led from his stall to the paddock? Lupe asked, her voice tight with frustration. Billy's weathered face creased with sympathy. Westbrook says you've done wonders with the horse's basic trust. Now it's time for professional transporters to take over the next phase. Throughout the morning, Lupe continued her regular routine with Thunderstorm, trying to maintain the calm, consistent environment that had allowed his gradual healing. But the sounds of construction, the metallic clangs, the shouts of workers, the rumble of equipment, filtered into the stable, causing the horse's ears to flick nervously and his muscles to tense beneath her hands. "Ignore them," she murmured in Spanish, massaging his neck with firm, rhythmic strokes. "Focus on my voice, my touch. This is our time." By midday, Richard Westbrook himself arrived to inspect the transport training area. Spotting Lupe in the paddock with Thunderstorm, he strode over, his Italian leather shoes incongruous against the sandy footing. "Miss Martinez," he called, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of Texas drawl and Eastern boarding school precision. "I trust Billy has informed you about our preparations." Lupe nodded, keeping her hand steady on Thunderstorm's lead rope as the horse shifted uneasily at Westbrook's approach. "Yes, sir, but I have concerns about the timeline. Thunderstorm isn't—" "Sheikh Abdullah's representatives have confirmed his visit for the 15th, Westbrook interrupted. "The transport specialists arrive tomorrow to begin acclimation training." He glanced at Thunderstorm, assessing the animal with the calculated gaze of an investor rather than a caretaker. "You've done remarkable work with his basic rehabilitation. The specialists will handle the technical aspects of preparing him for travel." "Mr. Westbrook," Lupe began carefully, choosing her words with precision. "Thunderstorm associates unfamiliar humans with pain and fear. Forcing new handlers on him now could trigger a significant regression." Westbrook's expression hardened. "Miss Martinez, I appreciate your concern, but this is a business decision. Sheikh Abdullah's breeding program represents the ideal future for Thunderstorm's bloodline. His facilities in Dubai are world-class. A facility can be world-class and still be wrong for a specific animal," Lupe replied, her voice soft but firm. "This discussion is academic," Westbrook said with finality. "The arrangements are made. Your role now is to assist the transport team in transitioning Thunderstorm to their care." As Westbrook walked away, Thunderstorm snorted loudly, pawing at the ground with one hoof, a clear expression of equine anxiety. Lupe stroked his neck, feeling the tremors beneath his skin, the physical manifestation of fear that no amount of specialized equipment could address. Later that afternoon, as Lupe was preparing to leave for her evening shift at the Dixie Diner, an unfamiliar luxury car pulled up beside the stables. Jackson Westbrook emerged, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat with the same innate grace his father possessed, though softened by a more thoughtful demeanor. "Ms. Martinez," he called, approaching with hands thrust deep in the pockets of his casual jeans. "Do you have a minute?" Lupe glanced at her watch. "A short one. I have another job starting soon." Jackson nodded, falling into step beside her as she walked toward her ancient Toyota pickup. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about Thunderstorm's situation." He hesitated, then continued with more urgency. "There's something you should know about my father's motivation with this horse." They paused beside Lupe's truck, its faded blue paint peeling in places, the contrast stark against Jackson's sleek BMW. "Thunderstorm reminds him of Midnight," Jackson said quietly. "My sister Rebecca's horse. They share the same basic conformation, the same coat color. Even that white sock on the right foreleg." Lupe waited silently, sensing there was more to the story than she had heard before. "Rebecca died 5 years ago," Jackson continued, his voice tightening. "She was riding Midnight when they attempted a jump that was beyond their capability. My father had pushed her to compete at higher levels, always higher." His hands clenched into fists inside his pockets. "She was thrown, died instantly. I'm very sorry," Lupe said softly. Since then, my father treats horses as pure investments, Jackson explained. No emotional attachment, no sentimental decisions. I think it's his way of coping with the guilt. He looked toward the stables where Thunderstorm was housed. When I see how you work with that horse, the patience, the respect for his fears, it reminds me of Rebecca. She understood horses the way you do. The evening shift at the Dixie Diner passed in a blur of orders, coffee refills, and the constant background chatter of the dinner crowd. Lupe moved through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her mind occupied with Jackson's revelations and the looming threat of Thunderstorm's transfer. As she wiped down the counter near closing time, she overheard a conversation from the booth nearest the register. Westbrook's got some Arab sheikh coming to look at that crazy horse, said Frank Miller, who supplied hay to several local farms. Heard he's offering millions just for breeding rights. Waste of money, replied his companion. That animal's finished after that fall. No amount of Mexican horse-whispering magic can fix shattered legs. Lupe kept her head down, focusing on the circular motion of her cloth against the formica surface. The casual cruelty of the comment stung, but she had long ago learned that Wayland County measured worth in familiar bloodlines and generational belonging, categories in which both she and Thunderstorm remained perpetual outsiders. The following morning brought the transport specialists, a team of 3 efficient men with clipboards, specialized equipment, and an air of detached professionalism that immediately set Thunderstorm on edge. Lupe watched from a distance as they consulted with Richard Westbrook, pointing toward the paddock and gesturing toward the trailer ramp they had assembled. Billy approached her, his expression grim. They want to start loading practice today, using food rewards and gradual exposure. He's not ready, Lupe said, the phrase becoming a mantra of futile resistance. I know, Billy agreed, surprising her with his direct support. But Westbrook insists they proceed on schedule. He hesitated, then added quietly, they want you there, to help with the transition. The session that followed was painful to witness. Despite Lupe's presence, Thunderstorm refused to approach the unfamiliar ramp. The lead specialist, a man named Garrett with 20 years of experience transporting valuable horses worldwide, attempted to lure the thoroughbred forward with grain, then with gentle pressure on the lead rope. Thunderstorm responded by planting his feet, his entire body rigid with resistance. He needs more time, Lupe insisted after 30 minutes of fruitless attempts. This is too much, too soon. Sheikh Abdullah arrives in 13 days, Garrett replied matter-of-factly. By then, this horse needs to load calmly into a transport carrier. We don't have the luxury of extended acclimatization. When Richard Westbrook arrived to observe the progress, his frustration was evident in the tight line of his mouth and the sharp gestures of his hands. What's the problem here? He demanded. I was assured your team could handle any horse. This animal has severe trust issues, Garrett explained. His trauma response is more pronounced than we anticipated. Westbrook's gaze shifted to Lupe, his expression calculating. Miss Martinez has established a connection with him. Perhaps she can demonstrate the loading process. All eyes turned to Lupe, standing quietly at Thunderstorm's shoulder. The horse leaned slightly against her, seeking reassurance in the familiar scent and touch that had become his only safe harbor in a world of unpredictable threats. I won't force him, she said simply. That would destroy the trust we've built. This is my horse, paid for with my money, Westbrook stated coldly. Your sentimental opinion has no place in business decisions. As the impasse stretched between them, Thunderstorm shifted nervously, sensing the tension. His ears flattened against his head, and a tremor ran through his powerful body. Lupe placed her hand on his neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her fingertips, the physical manifestation of fear that all the expertise and equipment in the world couldn't address. In that moment of silent standoff, Jackson Westbrook's BMW pulled up to the paddock fence. He stepped out, observing the scene with a frown before approaching his father. What's happening here? He asked, his voice carrying across the tense silence. Transport training, Richard replied shortly, which would proceed more efficiently if certain employees remembered their place. Jackson's gaze moved from his father to Lupe, then to Thunderstorm, whose body language screamed distress to anyone with the knowledge to read it. Without another word, he walked to the fence and leaned against it, making it clear he intended to observe the proceedings. "Continue," Richard instructed Garrett, pointedly ignoring his son's presence. For another painful hour, the specialists attempted various approaches to encourage Thunderstorm toward the ramp. Each failure increased Richard's irritation and deepened the horse's distress. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the paddock, Westbrook called a halt to the session. "We'll resume tomorrow," he announced. "I expect better results." As the specialists packed their equipment and Westbrook strode toward his waiting car, Jackson approached Lupe, who was gently leading Thunderstorm back toward the familiar safety of his stall. "My father never changes course once money's involved," he said quietly, falling into step beside her. "But I'll see what I can do." "I'll see what I can do," Jackson said, his words hanging in the air as he watched Lupe lead Thunderstorm back to the stable. The following morning dawned with a sense of urgency that Lupe couldn't shake. As she pulled into the Westbrook Estates service entrance, her ancient Toyota sputtering in protest at the early hour, she noticed Dorothy's sensible sedan already parked near the stables. The elderly librarian sat on a wooden bench outside, a thermos of tea beside her, her silver hair catching the first light of dawn. "You look like you haven't slept," Dorothy observed as Lupe approached. "I haven't," Lupe admitted. "Not really. Every time I close my eyes, I see Thunderstorm in a metal cargo hold, terrified, surrounded by strangers." Dorothy patted the bench beside her. "I've been thinking about our options. Jessica Harmon has agreed to meet us at the library this afternoon." Inside the stable, Thunderstorm nickered softly at Lupe's approach, extending his neck over the stall door. The previous day's transport training had left visible marks on his spirit, the tension in his muscles, the wariness in his eyes. Lupe rested her forehead against his, breathing deeply, allowing her own steady rhythm to communicate calm more effectively than words ever could. "We need allies," Dorothy continued as Lupe began her morning routine with Thunderstorm. "People willing to stand up to Richard Westbrook." By midday, the small group had grown. Sarah Jenkins arrived during her lunch break from teaching, bringing sandwich wraps and an idea. "My cousin runs a sanctuary for retired horses near Lexington," she explained, unwrapping the food. "She might be able to offer temporary shelter if we could somehow delay the transfer." Pastor Mike, initially reluctant to become involved in what he viewed as a business dispute, arrived at the library meeting with a changed perspective. He had visited the stables the previous evening, observing Lupe work with Thunderstorm from a respectful distance. "There is something sacred in that connection," he admitted to the group gathered in the library's private reading room. "Something that transcends the usual relationship between humans and animals." Jessica Harmon, a formidable woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair cut in a practical bob, spread legal documents across the polished oak table. "Legally, we're on shaky ground," she began without preamble. "Animals are property under Kentucky law. Westbrook has every right to sell or transfer Thunderstorm to whomever he pleases." "Even if it would harm the animal?" Dorothy asked. "There's emerging jurisprudence around animal welfare," Jessica acknowledged. "We might request an independent evaluation, arguing that transfer would constitute a risk to the animal's health. But we'd need compelling evidence and, ideally, expert testimony." Pastor Mike leaned forward. "What about Jackson Westbrook? If he were willing to testify about his father's motivations?" "A family member's testimony would strengthen the case considerably," Jessica agreed. "But it's a big ask, publicly opposing his father in court." The afternoon light slanted through the library windows as they discussed options, possibilities, and contingencies. When Lupe finally left for her evening shift at the Westbrook stables, she carried with her both hope and dread in equal measure. Meanwhile, Richard Westbrook had escalated his strategy. Upon arriving at the stable, Lupe discovered that Thunderstorm had been moved from his familiar stall to a larger training bay near the transport area. The horse stood tensely in the corner, his ears flicking nervously at every sound from the unfamiliar space. "Mr. Westbrook ordered the change," Billy explained apologetically. He wants Thunderstorm closer to the loading area for more efficient training sessions. Lupe's heart sank. The abrupt disruption of routine would set back weeks of careful progress. Did anyone explain to Thunderstorm why his safe space was suddenly taken away? She asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Billy had the grace to look ashamed. The transport team said the move would help acclimate him to change. That evening, Lupe worked late into the night, sitting quietly in Thunderstorm's new stall, reading aloud from The Black Stallion, as she had countless times before. Gradually, the horse's rigid posture softened, his breathing deepened, and he ventured closer to where she sat on a fresh hay bale. "I won't let them take you," she whispered in Spanish, a promise she had no clear way to keep. The next morning brought a more direct attack. When Lupe arrived for her shift at the Dixie Diner, Marge met her at the back entrance, her normally brusque demeanor softened by genuine concern. "Corporate called," she said without preamble. "They're cutting back hours. I had to assign shifts based on seniority." Lupe understood immediately. "How many hours am I losing?" "All of them," Marge admitted, not meeting her eyes. "At least for now." It didn't take detective work to recognize Westbrook's hand in this. The diner's owner, Jeffrey Barnes, sat on the board of the local bank where Westbrook held considerable influence. One phone call would have been sufficient. By afternoon, the pattern became unmistakable. Mrs. Wilson called to regretfully inform Lupe that her cleaning services would no longer be required, and that evening Lupe returned to her trailer to find an envelope taped to her door, a notice that the monthly rent would increase by 50%, effective immediately. "He's trying to run you out of town," Dorothy said grimly when Lupe called her with the news. "Richard Westbrook doesn't just remove obstacles, he crushes them." The following day brought even more insidious pressure. Sheriff Johnson's cruiser was parked outside the trailer park when Lupe returned from the stables. Though he didn't approach her directly, his presence sent a clear message to the Latino residents who gathered in worried clusters, whispering about immigration checks and documentation requirements. That night, sitting alone in her trailer with bills spread across her small kitchen table, Lupe faced the brutal arithmetic of her situation. Without the diner and cleaning jobs, she couldn't make the increased rent. Without shelter, she couldn't maintain her work with Thunderstorm. The elegant simplicity of Westbrook's strategy was devastating. A knock at her door startled her from these calculations. Billy Thompson stood on her small porch, looking uncomfortable in the civilian clothes she rarely saw him wear. "May I come in?" he asked, removing his weathered Stetson. Inside the immaculate but tiny trailer, Billy perched awkwardly on a kitchen chair, declining the offer of coffee with a shake of his head. "Thunderstorm's not eating," he said without preamble. "Since you left this afternoon, he's been pacing, looking toward the door. The transport team can't get near him." Lupe's heart constricted. "He knows something's wrong." Billy nodded. "Animals sense these things." He hesitated, then added, "I could let you in after hours, around 2 in the morning. No one checks the security cameras for that sector until morning shift." The risk Billy was taking, his job of 23 years, his reputation, his retirement security, hung unspoken between them. "Why would you do that?" Lupe asked quietly. Billy stared at his calloused hands for a long moment. "My daddy worked with horses all his life. Used to say you can tell everything about a man by how he treats animals and those who care for them." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I've made my judgment about Richard Westbrook, and about you." That night, under a moonless sky, Lupe's Toyota crept along the service road with headlights extinguished. Billy waited by the back entrance, his flashlight a brief flicker in the darkness. Together they moved silently through the sleeping stable, the only sounds the occasional soft nicker of horses disturbed from slumber. When they reached Thunderstorm's new stall, the horse was already alert, his head raised, nostrils flaring as he caught Lupe's scent. The soft wicker of recognition he gave pierced her heart. "Just an hour," Billy whispered, handing her the stall key. "I'll be back." Alone with Thunderstorm, Lupe slipped inside the stall, and the powerful animal immediately pressed his head against her chest, trembling slightly as if afraid she might disappear again. She stroked his neck, murmuring reassurances in Spanish, feeling the gradual relaxation of his tense muscles under her touch. "I'm trying to find a way," she promised him, her forehead pressed against his. "Don't give up." For the next 3 nights, this clandestine routine continued. Billy risked his job to grant Lupe an hour with Thunderstorm in the small hours of the morning. During these precious moments, she sang to him, read to him, or simply sat in companionable silence, maintaining the bond that had become essential to both of them. On the 4th night, as Lupe slipped back into her truck after one such visit, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the service road. Dorothy Abernathy, wrapped in a heavy cardigan against the autumn chill, raised a hand in greeting. "I suspected you might be making night visits," the librarian said, climbing into the passenger seat without invitation. "We need to talk strategy." Back at Lupe's trailer, a small gathering had assembled despite the late hour. Jessica Harmon nursed a cup of strong coffee at the tiny kitchen table. Sarah Jenkins sat cross-legged on the floor, spreading out papers containing sanctuary information. Pastor Mike stood by the window, keeping watch while pretending not to. "We've been thinking," Dorothy began once Lupe had settled. "If legal channels are too slow, we might need a more direct approach." Jessica nodded. "The Sheikh arrives in 4 days. If we could temporarily relocate Thunderstorm before then—" "You mean take him?" Lupe interrupted, alarmed. "That would be stealing." "Technically, yes," Jessica acknowledged. "But morally, it could be considered rescue." As the night deepened, the plan took shape. Sarah's cousin had agreed to shelter Thunderstorm temporarily at her sanctuary, while legal proceedings were initiated. Billy would help with access and transportation. Pastor Mike, despite obvious discomfort with the law-bending aspects, offered his church van to transport supporters. "It's risky," Jessica warned. "If caught, you could face charges of grand theft." "And if we do nothing?" Lupe asked quietly. No one answered. The question hung in the air, weighted with the knowledge of what awaited Thunderstorm if Sheikh Abdullah's purchase proceeded. The following morning, Lupe received an unexpected text message from Jackson Westbrook. "Need to talk. Important news about tea meet at library?" Dorothy arranged for them to use the small conference room, ensuring privacy for the conversation. Jackson arrived looking troubled, his usual composed demeanor frayed at the edges. "My father has accelerated the timeline," he said without preamble. "Sheikh Abdullah is arriving early, the day after tomorrow. The papers are already drawn up." Lupe felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. 2 days? But the transport team said Thunderstorm wasn't ready. "The Sheikh's representatives assured my father they have specialists who can manage difficult animals," Jackson explained. "They've agreed to assume all risk during transport." The implications were clear. Thunderstorm's psychological well-being was irrelevant to the transaction. Only his genetic material mattered. "We can't wait any longer," Lupe said, decision crystallizing. "We need to move tonight." As darkness fell over Wayland County that evening, an unlikely alliance prepared for action. Billy Thompson waited at the service entrance with keys and security codes. Sarah Jenkins arrived with her cousin's horse trailer, borrowed from a sympathetic neighbor to avoid suspicion. Dorothy, Jessica, and Pastor Mike positioned themselves as lookouts along the route. "Only one option left," Jessica said, addressing the small group gathered in the church parking lot. "We need to secure a temporary injunction, claiming the transfer would place the animal at risk. But for that, we'll need someone within the Westbrook family willing to testify against Richard." All eyes turned to Pastor Mike, who had mentioned his recent contact with Jackson Westbrook. All eyes turned to Pastor Mike, who had mentioned his recent contact with Jackson Westbrook. The pastor shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face catching the dim light of the church parking lot. Jackson is wrestling with this decision. Standing against his father publicly would sever what little relationship they still have. Lupe looked at the small gathering. Dorothy with her silver hair glinting in the moonlight, Jessica with her arms crossed in determined consideration, Sarah nervously checking her watch. Billy standing apart from the group, his loyalty to the Westbrook family visibly at war with his conscience. "We can't wait for Jackson's decision," Lupe said finally. "Thunderstorm needs us now." Under the cover of darkness, they moved with practiced precision. Billy led them through the service entrance, disabling the security system with a code few people knew existed. The stable at night was a cathedral of soft breathing and occasional shuffling, $30 million worth of horseflesh resting in temperature-controlled comfort. Thunderstorm was alert the moment they approached, his acute senses having picked up Lupe's familiar scent. He nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against the stall door. "Hola, mi corazón," she whispered, slipping inside. "We're going on a journey." The lightweight halter slid easily over Thunderstorm's head, the horse standing perfectly still as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Billy watched with undisguised amazement. "I've seen a lot in 40 years with horses," he murmured, "but never anything like this." Leading Thunderstorm through the darkened stable corridor required every ounce of Lupe's hard-won trust. Each unfamiliar shadow, each shifting patch of moonlight through the windows represented potential triggers for a traumatized animal whose memory of catastrophe remained painfully fresh. Yet he followed her willingly, his powerful body trembling slightly but moving forward on the strength of his connection to the one human who had never demanded anything from him. Outside, Sarah waited with the borrowed trailer. Its ramp, the very obstacle that had defeated professional handlers for weeks, loomed before them. "Take your time," Jessica whispered, tension evident in her voice. "But also hurry." Lupe ignored everyone, focusing entirely on Thunderstorm. She led him in a small circle near the trailer, allowing him to observe it from all angles. Then she walked up the ramp herself, stood inside for a moment, and walked back down. "It's safe," she told him in Spanish. "I would never lead you to danger." Thunderstorm's nostrils flared, drinking in the unfamiliar scents. His ears swiveled forward then back, processing every sound in the night-draped property. Then, with deliberate care, he placed one hoof on the ramp, testing its stability. "That's it," Lupe encouraged softly. "One step at a time." The process was agonizingly slow. Each advance up the ramp was followed by a pause, a reconsideration, sometimes a backward step before progress resumed. The small group watched in tense silence, every minute increasing their vulnerability to discovery. And then, with a final decisive movement, Thunderstorm stepped fully into the trailer. Lupe secured him with practiced hands, murmuring reassurances as Sarah carefully closed the partition. "I'll ride with him," Lupe said, climbing into the small side compartment. "He needs to know I'm here." Just as Billy was preparing to close the trailer door, a harsh spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene in stark relief. A security vehicle rounded the corner, its headlights followed by the unmistakable red and blue flashing of a sheriff's cruiser. "Somebody tipped them off," Jessica hissed, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. Richard Westbrook emerged from the security vehicle, his tall frame silhouetted against the headlights. Behind him, Sheriff Johnson approached with one hand resting on his service weapon. "What do we have here?" Westbrook's voice carried easily across the stable yard. "A midnight excursion with my $2 million investment." Billy stepped forward, placing himself between Westbrook and the trailer. "Mr. Westbrook, if you just listen—" "Save it, Thompson," Westbrook cut him off coldly. 23 years of employment, and this is how you repay my family's trust? By conspiring to steal my property?" Sheriff Johnson moved forward, his expression professionally neutral but his posture uncomfortable. "Miss Martinez, please step out of the trailer." Inside the trailer compartment, Lupe could feel Thunderstorm's mounting anxiety through the thin partition. The unfamiliar voices, the harsh lights, the tension-filled atmosphere, all the triggers of his trauma converging at once. "He's getting agitated," she called through the window. "Please, dim the lights at least." "Step out of the trailer now," Sheriff Johnson repeated, his voice firmer. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Dorothy moved forward, her small frame somehow commanding in the harsh spotlight. "Richard Westbrook, You know exactly what you're doing to that animal. Is money really worth destroying a soul that's finally beginning to heal? Westbrook's face hardened. Spare me the sentimentality, Dorothy. This is about property rights, pure and simple. He turned to the sheriff. I want them all charged with attempted grand theft. The standoff intensified as neighbors from nearby properties, alerted by the commotion and flashing lights, began to gather at the edges of the Westbrook property. Local faces Lupe recognized from the diner, the church, the hardware store, the ordinary people of Wayland County drawn to the unfolding drama. Inside the trailer, Thunderstorm's anxiety escalated. He began to kick at the partition, his powerful hooves threatening the thin barrier that separated him from escape. Lupe tried to calm him, but the external chaos overwhelmed her soothing words. With a final powerful kick, Thunderstorm broke through the partition. The trailer door, improperly secured in the haste and confusion, swung open. Before anyone could react, the massive thoroughbred burst out, nearly trampling Billy in his panicked exit. "Thunderstorm!" Lupe called, scrambling from the trailer. But the horse was beyond hearing. Terror had reclaimed him completely, erasing months of careful rehabilitation in an instant of overwhelming fear. He galloped wildly across the manicured grounds, mane flying in the moonlight, his movements both beautiful and heartbreaking in their desperation. "Get the tranquilizer gun!" Westbrook shouted to one of the security guards, "before he injures himself or someone else." Sheriff Johnson turned to his deputy. "Radio for backup. We need to contain the area." Amidst the chaos, Lupe made a decision. Ignoring the shouted commands to stay put, she ran after Thunderstorm, not in pursuit, but in parallel, keeping a respectful distance as he circled the property in panic. "Let her go," Dorothy called as Sheriff Johnson moved to intercept Lupe. "She's the only one who can calm him." The gathering crowd of neighbors watched in tense silence as Lupe followed the terrified horse, gradually closing the distance between them. When Thunderstorm finally slowed, sides heaving from exertion, she approached slowly, palms open, speaking in the gentle Spanish that had become their private language of trust. "Estoy aquí," she said softly. "I'm here. You're not alone." For a moment that stretched into eternity, Thunderstorm stood trembling, poised between flight and trust. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened observers, he lowered his head and stepped toward Lupe, choosing connection over fear. The moment was shattered by Richard Westbrook's voice, harsh with command. "Sheriff, arrest that woman before she disappears with my horse." Sheriff Johnson moved forward reluctantly, handcuffs ready. "Miss Martinez, please step away from the horse." Lupe didn't resist as the cold metal closed around her wrists. Her eyes remained on Thunderstorm, who stood unnaturally still, watching as she was led to the patrol car. "You're making a mistake," Dorothy called to Westbrook. "Look at what she's accomplished with that animal. Look at what you're destroying." But Westbrook's face remained impassive as he instructed his security team to return Thunderstorm to the stables. As the handlers approached with ropes, the horse's demeanor changed instantly, ears flattened, muscles tensed for flight. "He won't go with them," Billy warned. "You'll just cause another incident." Ignoring the warning, the handlers attempted to corral Thunderstorm with standard techniques. The result was predictable. The horse bolted again, this time heading directly for the open gate that led to the county road. What happened next would be recounted in Wayland County for years to come. As Lupe was being placed in the back of the sheriff's cruiser, Thunderstorm veered suddenly in her direction. Despite his injured hindquarters, despite months of rehabilitation that had only partially restored his physical capabilities, the powerful thoroughbred followed the patrol car for hundreds of meters along the property line, his determination transcending his limitations. Phones emerged from pockets, capturing the extraordinary scene. A handcuffed woman in the back of a police car, tears streaming down her scarred face, and a once broken racehorse running alongside, refusing to be separated from the one person who had reconnected him with trust. Sheriff Johnson, watching the scene unfold in his rearview mirror, slowed the cruiser unconsciously, his professional detachment wavering in the face of such naked devotion. "Not stealing anything," Lupe said quietly from the back seat. "Saving a life." By morning, Jessica Harmon had arranged for Lupe's release on bail, funded by anonymous contributions from community members who had witnessed the night's events or seen the viral videos already circulating on local social media. As Lupe emerged from the county jail, she found a small gathering waiting: Dorothy, Pastor Mike, Sarah, and several faces she recognized from the diner and church. "The story Wayland County needed," declared Jim Coulter, the editor of the local newspaper, as he finished typing the front-page headline featuring the dramatic photo of thunderstorm following the police car. "And tomorrow, when the sheikh arrives to take that horse, half the county will be at the gates of Westbrook Estate. The question is, which side of the story does Richard Westbrook want to be on?" Dawn broke over Wayland County with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, as if nature itself wanted perfect visibility for what would unfold. The rising sun painted the rolling Kentucky hills in amber light, illuminating the unusual gathering forming outside the ornate gates of the Westbrook Estate. Pickup trucks parked alongside luxury SUVs, their drivers standing in small clusters, voices hushed but faces determined. By 6:30 in the morning, more than 50 people had assembled: diner waitresses arriving straight off night shifts, farmers who had left chores undone, teachers who would be missed in classrooms. Dorothy Abernathy sat in her aging Buick, coordinating arrivals with the efficiency of a general. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her cardigan buttoned precisely, as if the formality of her appearance might lend legitimacy to what many would call a protest. "Pastor Mike just called," she informed Sarah Jenkins, who leaned through the car window. "He's bringing Lupe from the bail hearing. Should be here within 20 minutes. Inside the estate gates, activity had begun well before sunrise. Stable hands moved with unusual urgency, polishing brass fixtures and laying fresh gravel on pathways. A massive white tent had been erected near the main paddock, its sides open to reveal elegant tables covered in emerald green cloth, Westbrook racing colors. Uniformed caterers arranged silver trays while security personnel in dark suits surveyed the perimeter, speaking quietly into discreet earpieces. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Richard Westbrook, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, directing staff with the precision of a man accustomed to compliance. His face betrayed no reaction to the growing crowd beyond his gates, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward the road with calculated assessment. In a separate wing of the stables, isolated from the preparations, Thunderstorm stood in his stall. The events of the previous night had taken their toll. The thoroughbred's sleek coat was dulled by sweat stains, his powerful muscles tense beneath the skin. A veterinarian administered a mild sedative while two handlers stood by nervously. "Just enough to take the edge off," instructed Dr. Morrison, watching the medication slowly enter the horse's system. "Sheikh Abdullah wants to see him alert, not drugged into compliance." The thoroughbred's eyes, usually so expressive and intelligent when Lupe was present, had taken on a vacant quality that troubled the veterinarian more than he cared to admit. In his 30 years of practice, Dr. Morrison had witnessed countless horses pushed beyond their psychological limits for human ambition. Thunderstorm's case felt different. The animal had been climbing back from the abyss, finding a foothold on trust, only to have it crumble beneath him. Outside the gates, the crowd parted as Pastor Mike's modest sedan pulled up. Lupe emerged from the passenger seat, her face showing the exhaustion of a night spent in county lockup. The oversized clothes she wore, borrowed from a church donation box after her release, hung loosely on her frame. Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity that commanded more respect than Westbrook's tailored authority ever could. "You shouldn't have come," she said to the gathered crowd, her voice soft with concern. "You could lose jobs, business contracts." "Some things matter more than business," replied Eleanor Peterson, whose husband's hardware store depended heavily on Westbrook Estate purchases. She pressed a handwritten sign into Lupe's hands. "Healing takes time. Respect the process." As Lupe stood uncertainly at the edge of the gathering, a sleek convoy of black SUVs approached from the main highway. The vehicles moved with synchronized precision, their tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants within. When they reached the gates, Security personnel moved immediately to clear a path, confirming what everyone already knew. Sheikh Abdullah had arrived. The first vehicle disgorged 4 men in dark suits who quickly established a perimeter. From the central SUV emerged Sheikh Abdullah himself, a distinguished man in his 60s wearing traditional Gulf attire, his bearing regal, but his eyes alert and curious as they swept over the unexpected gathering at the gates. "What is happening here?" he asked one of his aides in Arabic, the translation quickly provided to the Westbrook security team. "A small local disagreement," the head of security replied smoothly. "Nothing that concerns today's business, Your Excellency." As the Sheikh's entourage was escorted through the gates, Lupe felt a hand on her shoulder. Jessica Harmon stood beside her, a manila folder tucked under her arm. "The judge signed it," she said quietly. "We have a temporary injunction preventing any transfer of ownership until an independent evaluation can be conducted." She gestured to a man in a sheriff's uniform standing nearby. "Officer Daniels is authorized to serve the papers." For the first time since her release, Lupe felt a flicker of hope. "They'll let us in?" "They have to," Jessica confirmed. "It's a court order." The confrontation at the gate unfolded with the tension of opposing forces meeting on a battlefield. Officer Daniels, clearly uncomfortable but resolute, presented the legal documents to the head of Westbrook Security. "I need to speak with Mr. Westbrook," he stated firmly. "And I'm authorized to admit Ms. Martinez and Dr. Wilson," he nodded toward a silver-haired man standing with Jessica, "to conduct an immediate welfare assessment of the animal in question." Inside the main paddock area, Richard Westbrook was midway through his practiced introduction when a security officer approached, whispering urgently in his ear. The businessman's expression darkened momentarily before reasserting its professional mask. "Sheikh Abdullah," he said smoothly, "would you excuse me for a brief moment? A minor administrative matter requires my attention." At the gate, Westbrook's arrival created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. He addressed Officer Daniels with cold precision. "This is harassment," he stated, barely glancing at the legal papers. "My attorneys will have this dismissed by noon." "Until then, sir," Officer Daniels replied, "the injunction remains in effect. Ms. Martinez and Dr. Wilson must be permitted to examine the horse before any transfer proceedings can continue." For a moment that stretched like wire under tension. It seemed Westbrook might refuse. Then, with the calculation of a man who had navigated countless business confrontations, he nodded curtly. "Let them in," he instructed the security team. "But only them." As Lupe walked through the gates she had been forbidden to approach just hours earlier, the weight of dozens of supportive gazes followed her. Dorothy gave her a small nod of encouragement. Pastor Mike's lips moved in what might have been a prayer. The path to the stables had never felt longer. With each step, Lupe's concern for Thunderstorm intensified. What state would she find him in after the trauma of the previous night? Would the trust they had built survive such a profound disruption? Dr. Wilson, a respected equine behavior specialist from the University of Kentucky, walked beside her in thoughtful silence. Finally, he spoke. "I've reviewed the videos from last night," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything quite like it, the way he followed the police car. That level of attachment is extraordinary in an animal with such severe trauma history." When they reached the isolation wing, Billy Thompson was waiting outside Thunderstorm's stall, his weathered face lined with worry. "They sedated him," he informed them immediately. "Nothing heavy, but he's not himself." Lupe's heart sank as she approached the stall. Thunderstorm stood with head lowered, his normally alert eyes dulled by medication. When he registered her presence, his reaction was delayed. A slow lifting of his head, a delayed flicker of his ears. "Oh, Corazon," she whispered, slipping into the stall despite Dr. Wilson's cautionary gesture. For several heartbeats, Thunderstorm merely looked at her, as if struggling to connect her presence with his sedated consciousness. Then, with visible effort, he extended his neck toward her, nostrils flaring to confirm her scent. Dr. Wilson observed from outside the stall, taking careful notes. "Talk to him," he encouraged. "Do what you would normally do." Lupe began to hum softly. the same Mexican lullaby that had first connected them during the thunderstorm months ago. Her hand gently stroked Thunderstorm's neck, feeling the tension gradually release under her touch. She spoke to him in a mixture of English and Spanish, the familiar cadence of her voice creating a bubble of calm in the midst of chaos. Gradually, like a fog lifting, awareness returned to Thunderstorm's eyes. Recognition deepened. His breathing synchronized with hers, a phenomenon Dr. Wilson noted with fascinated attention. Outside the stable, the official reception continued. Sheikh Abdullah was guided through a presentation of Westbrook's racing achievements, though his attention seemed to drift repeatedly toward the stable where the assessment was taking place. "The horse has extraordinary bloodlines," Westbrook was explaining, directing an assistant to display genetic charts. "His Derby performance before the accident demonstrated exceptional speed and heart." "And his current condition?" the Sheikh inquired, his English precise and formal. "Improving steadily," Westbrook assured him. "The physical rehabilitation has progressed beyond initial expectations. Yet, I understand there are complications," the Sheikh observed mildly. "The gathering at your gates suggests unusual circumstances." Before Westbrook could formulate a diplomatic response, the stable doors opened. Dr. Wilson emerged, followed by Lupe leading Thunderstorm. The sight stopped all conversation instantly. The thoroughbred moved with visible stiffness. His injuries would never fully heal, but his demeanor had transformed. Despite the lingering effects of sedation, his head was raised, ears forward, attention fixed entirely on Lupe, who walked slightly ahead, connected by nothing more than a simple lead rope and the invisible bond between them. Sheikh Abdullah stepped forward, genuine interest replacing diplomatic courtesy in his expression. "Remarkable," he murmured. The videos did not exaggerate. As if aware he was being discussed, Thunderstorm turned his gaze toward the gathering. His ears flattened momentarily at the sight of strangers, his body tensing in preparation for flight. But a soft word from Lupe, a gentle touch on his neck, and the panic receded, not gone, but managed through trust. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Wilson stated, addressing both Westbrook and the Sheikh. "The bond between this handler and this horse represents a breakthrough in trauma recovery that deserves scientific documentation." Through the open gates, the gathered crowd had grown. Word had spread through Wayland County about the confrontation unfolding at the Westbrook estate. Farmers left fields unharvested, mechanics abandoned repairs, teachers dismissed classes early, all drawn to witness the culmination of a story that had come to represent something profound about their community. The critical moment came when Jackson Westbrook's BMW pulled up to the estate entrance. Unlike the controlled arrival of the Sheikh's entourage, Jackson's approach had an improvised quality. The car parked at an angle, the door left open as he strode purposefully toward his father. Richard Westbrook's face tightened at the sight of his son. Their estrangement was common knowledge in Wayland County, though its causes remained private family business. "Dad," Jackson called, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn, "we need to talk." "This isn't the time," Richard replied coldly. "It's exactly the time," Jackson insisted, stepping closer. "Rebecca wouldn't want this." The mention of his daughter's name struck Richard like a physical blow. Color drained from his face as Jackson continued. "She loved her horses as family, not as investments. She would be horrified to see what you're doing." A silence fell over the gathering, heavy with the weight of private grief made suddenly public. Sheikh Abdullah, with the cultural sensitivity of a man accustomed to navigating complex social situations, stepped back slightly, giving father and son the illusion of privacy. "Is there some problem with the animal?" he inquired softly of his translator. Before anyone could respond, Jessica Harmon approached with the court documents. "Your Excellency," she began with respectful formality, "I regret to inform you that we have a temporary injunction from the state court suspending any transfer of ownership until an independent evaluation of the animal's psychological condition can be completed." The confrontation had reached its pivotal moment. All the tensions that had built over months, between father and son, between corporate power and community values, between profit and compassion, converged in this sunlit paddock with Thunderstorm and Lupe at the center. The confrontation had reached its pivotal moment. All the tensions that had built over months, between father and son, between corporate power and community values, between profit and compassion, converged in this sunlit paddock with Thunderstorm and Lupe at the center. In the tense silence that followed, Thunderstorm grew increasingly agitated. His ears flattened against his head, and a tremor ran through his powerful frame. The thoroughbred could sense the conflicting human emotions surrounding him: anger, determination, greed, compassion, a storm of intentions that threatened to overwhelm his fragile recovery. Lupe felt his distress immediately, the vibration of fear traveling through the lead rope to her hand. She stepped closer to him, placing her body between the horse and the crowd, creating a physical barrier against the overwhelming stimuli. "Estoy aquí," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Focus on me, just me." While legal arguments intensified between Jessica, Westbrook, and the Sheikh's representatives, Thunderstorm's breathing grew more rapid. His nostrils flared, pulling in short, panicked breaths that signaled imminent flight. The handlers stationed around the paddock shifted nervously, preparing for another chaotic escape attempt. In that critical moment, when the culmination of months of healing teetered on the edge of collapse, Lupe made a decision born of pure instinct. She unclipped the lead rope from Thunderstorm's halter, releasing him from physical restraint. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. "Doctor." Morrison stepped forward with an alarmed exclamation. Even Dorothy, watching from the gate, pressed a hand to her mouth in surprise. "What are you doing?" Westbrook demanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Secure that animal immediately." But Lupe ignored him completely. With deliberate movements, she turned her back on the crowd and walked slowly toward the center of the paddock. She carried nothing, no rope, no treats, no tools of control. Just her presence, offered freely in the space she shared with the frightened animal. Thunderstorm stood frozen, suddenly unbound in the midst of chaos. Every instinct honed by millions of years of equine evolution screamed at him to run, to escape the pressing threat of human tension. His muscles bunched, hindquarters lowering slightly in preparation for explosive movement. Yet he didn't run. His eyes, dark pools of intelligence and memory, remained fixed on Lupe's retreating back. Something stronger than fear held him in place, the recognition of the one constant in his shattered world, the one human whose presence had never brought pain. "What is she doing?" Sheikh Abdullah asked softly, genuine curiosity replacing diplomatic formality. Dr. Wilson, the equine behavior specialist, answered without taking his eyes from the unfolding scene. "Something remarkable. She's giving him choice." In the center of the paddock, Lupe stopped walking. She stood quietly, back still turned to Thunderstorm, her posture relaxed despite the tension crackling through the air around them. Then, with the same gentleness she had shown from their first encounter, she began to hum, the Mexican lullaby that had bridged their worlds during that first thunderstorm. Thunderstorm's ears swiveled forward, capturing the familiar melody. His head lowered slightly, the first sign of relaxation. One tentative step forward, then another. Each movement a choice, each choice a statement of trust rebuilt from the ashes of trauma. The audience around the paddock fell silent, collective breath held as the powerful thoroughbred closed the distance to Lupe. When he reached her, he simply stood at her shoulder, his body aligned with hers, two beings sharing space and silence in perfect understanding. "Remarkable," murmured Dr. Wilson, scribbling notes furiously. "I've never seen anything like this level of trust recovery in an animal with such severe psychological trauma." Sheikh Abdullah stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "In my country we have a saying, al-ruh al-mutasila, connected souls. It is rare between humans and animals, but when it exists, it is sacred." He turned to Westbrook. "How much do you want for him?" Richard Westbrook, seasoned negotiator that he was, recognized the shift in leverage. Despite the injunction, despite his son's public opposition, Here was the opportunity to extract maximum value from a situation slipping beyond his control. "The price we discussed remains acceptable," he replied smoothly. "My team can prepare the modified contracts immediately." The Sheikh continued to observe Lupe and Thunderstorm, who remained in their bubble of mutual trust, untouched by the negotiations surrounding them. "The woman would need to accompany the horse, of course," he added. "At least initially, such a bond should not be broken." Something in Jackson Westbrook's face changed at these words. He stepped closer to his father, voice low but intense. "Is that what you've become, Dad? Someone who sells bonds of trust to the highest bidder?" Richard's jaw tightened. "This is business, Jackson. The girl would be well compensated. Like Mom was? Like Rebecca?" Jackson's words struck with surgical precision. Money doesn't heal everything. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed with a checkbook. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard Westbrook's composed features. His gaze shifted to the center of the paddock, where Lupe had now turned to face Thunderstorm. Her hand rested gently on the horse's forehead, their eyes meeting in silent communication. There was something in that connection that transcended his comprehension, something that reminded him painfully of Rebecca's quiet insistence that horses were more than genetic investments or racing machines. In the paddock, unaware of the negotiations that would determine their future, Lupe pressed her forehead against Thunderstorm's. "Whatever happens," she whispered in Spanish, "remember this moment. Remember that you are brave enough to trust again." Thunderstorm exhaled deeply, his breath warm against her face. The thoroughbred who had once been deemed too dangerous to approach now stood in perfect calm. His massive body relaxed despite the circle of strangers watching their every move. "He's not for sale." The words fell into the silence with the weight of stones dropped in still water. Richard Westbrook had spoken, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority, instead holding a quality no one in Wayland County had heard from him before: uncertainty. "Not anymore," he added, as if confirming the decision for himself. Sheikh Abdullah studied the businessman carefully, recognizing the rare sight of a man changing course against his own financial interest. With the graciousness of true wealth, he inclined his head slightly. "I understand. Some possessions transcend ownership." He gestured toward Lupe and Thunderstorm. "Perhaps we might discuss breeding rights at a later date, when the animal has fully recovered." As the Sheikh's entourage began to disperse, preparing for departure, the crowd at the gates erupted in cheers and applause. The sound startled Thunderstorm, who tensed momentarily before relaxing again under Lupe's steadying touch. Jackson approached his father, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of years of estrangement. "What changed your mind?" Richard Westbrook watched Lupe leading Thunderstorm in a slow circle around the paddock, the horse following her with the fluid grace that had once made him a contender for racing's highest honors. "Your sister," he admitted quietly. "Rebecca always said I didn't understand horses. I thought it was sentimentality." He paused, the mask of the successful businessman slipping to reveal the grieving father beneath. "Maybe I didn't want to understand. Understanding means caring, and caring hurts when you lose what you care about." In the weeks that followed, Wayland County witnessed a transformation that few could have predicted. Richard Westbrook, in a move that stunned the racing world, announced the creation of the Rebecca Westbrook Foundation for Equine Recovery. Its first action was the purchase of 30 acres adjacent to town for the establishment of Hope Ranch, a rehabilitation center for traumatized horses. The announcement came at a small press conference where Westbrook, looking uncharacteristically subdued, explained the foundation's mission. "My daughter believed in the healing power of connection between humans and horses. This foundation will honor her vision." When reporters asked who would lead the program, Westbrook stepped aside to reveal Lupe standing quietly behind him. "Miss Martinez has demonstrated methods of trauma recovery that challenge conventional wisdom. She will serve as the program's director." Thunderstorm became the first permanent resident of Hope Ranch, his role evolving from patient to teacher for other traumatized animals. Billy Thompson, after 23 years with the Westbrook operation, resigned his position to become the ranch's manager, bringing decades of practical experience to complement Lupe's intuitive approach. The impact of Hope Ranch extended beyond animal rehabilitation. In partnership with the county's Social Services Department, Lupe initiated a program for traumatized children, particularly those in the foster care system. Her facial scar, once a source of uncomfortable stares, became a symbol of resilience for children carrying their own visible and invisible wounds. On a quiet afternoon 6 months after the foundation's creation, Richard Westbrook visited the ranch unannounced. He stood at the fence line, watching Lupe work with Thunderstorm and a 12-year-old girl who had survived the car accident that killed her parents. The girl's physical scars were still angry and red, but her expression as she tentatively stroked Thunderstorm's neck held something that had been missing in previous therapy sessions: hope. "Rebecca would have loved this," Westbrook commented to Dorothy Abernathy, who had become a regular volunteer. "She always said I didn't understand horses." "Never too late to learn," the librarian replied gently. The most symbolic moment came exactly 6 months after the foundation of the ranch. In a small private ceremony attended only by those who had stood by Lupe through the darkest days, she finally mounted Thunderstorm for the first time, not with a racing saddle or competition equipment, but with a simple blanket. Dr. Morrison, initially skeptical about the horse's physical recovery, confirmed what many already suspected. "The regeneration is medically inexplicable," he admitted, reviewing the latest radiographs. "His body has healed in ways that shouldn't be possible according to conventional veterinary understanding." As Hope Ranch's reputation grew, attracting visitors from neighboring states and eventually other countries, Lupe remained unchanged, dedicated, gentle, speaking softly to each animal as if it were the only one in the world. Her methodology, eventually documented by researchers from the University of Kentucky, challenged traditional paradigms of equine rehabilitation. On a particularly beautiful spring morning, exactly 1 year after the confrontation at the Westbrook estate gates, Lupe and Thunderstorm were seen galloping freely across the ranch's rolling fields. The horse that doctors had declared permanently disabled moved with the grace and power that had once made him legendary on the racetrack. The woman whom society had marginalized for her appearance and origin rode with absolute confidence, her scarred face bathed in the rising sun. From the veranda of the ranch's small office, Richard Westbrook observed the scene with his son at his side. "I think I finally understand what Rebecca tried to tell me," he admitted. "It's not about dominating the spirit, but respecting it." Jackson smiled, watching as Lupe and Thunderstorm slowed their pace and stopped at the top of a distant hill. Like that sign Lupe put at the entrance, broken souls can heal each other when they find a safe place to be exactly what they are. As the sun fully illuminated Hope Ranch, revealing dozens of rescued horses and the children arriving for another day of shared healing, Thunderstorm and Lupe remained on the hilltop, silhouettes against the sky, living symbols of a simple yet profound truth. True power lies not in control, but in connection.